of Matthew Lap Train Guy segment show. Also today in this segment, I'm at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. The Mid-Continent Railway Museum is located on Museum Road and Diamond Hill Road, which is located 14 miles off the I-90, I-94 in North Freedom, Wisconsin. And to see what the hours are, do check the web. The museum began as the Railroad Historical Society of Milwaukee in 1959. In 1962, the first excursion was on the Hillsborough and Northeastern Railway's 5 miles of line between Union Center and Hillsborough, Wisconsin. Then, in 1963, the Society's growing collection moved to North Freedom, which is its permanent home, and also there are train rides given, and the line is a former Chicago and Northwestern Rail line that was built in 1903, and it was originally Chicago and Northwestern's Rattlesnake Spur. A 7-mile line first opened in 1903 to serve the Iroquois and Illinois iron ore mines in LaRue, Wisconsin. Then, in 1913, after the mines closed, the track returned to use in 1918 when a quarry purchased it. Once again was abandoned in 1962. Then, in 1963, it was rebuilt, and also it became a perfect home for the newly renamed Mid-Continent Railway Museum, which bought the line and has owned it ever since. Also, the ride takes you all the way to the siding near the quarry that is abandoned, where the locomotive runs around the train and then returns to the museum grounds. The museum operates excursions on the line from mid-May to Labor Day. Also, between 1975 and 1976, a car barn was built by volunteers and housed a number of static displays. Also, the museum's collection emphasizes the preservation of railroad items operated in the upper Midwest from the period of 1880 to 1916, and is what the organization refers to as the Golden Age of Railroading. In 2008, there was a terrible flood from the Baraboo River on the museum grounds, and the museum was temporarily closed for repairs until February of 2009. And the bridge that crosses the Baraboo River was closed for 10 years because of it, and it was reopened in 2018, and also in the fall that year there was a terrible flood once again from the Baraboo River, but eventually all the water was gone and cleared up, and the museum soon reopened, and some of the equipment had to be evacuated and carried off the property on the main line as well. In 2019, the new display building that was constructed in 2017 was finished. Also, the museum still continues to preserve railroad history as well. This water tower was built between 1972 and 1975 by museum volunteers, and this one had been built for the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it looks like a water tower that may have been used on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, and also it is used to fill water into steam locomotives' water tanks as well, for when there is steam operations happening at the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Soo Line 2017.
Soo Line 2017 was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1914 and is a diner lounge car. This car was originally built as a passenger coach, and the car had plush walkover seats, electric lighting, and full vestibules. The car was updated over the years as the Soo Line equipped it with air conditioning and removed the under clerestory window sashes. In 1948, it was rebuilt as a diner lounge car by the Soo Line and at its Shoreham shops in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the vestibule on the lounge end of the car was removed. Also, the car was regularly used on the Soo Line's Laker between Chicago and the Twin Cities until the passenger train was discontinued in 1966. In that year, the car was retired, and in 1966, the car was sold to a private individual and moved to Hayward, Wisconsin, where it was stored for several years. Then, in 1971, it was resold and moved to Duluth, Minnesota, where it was completely restored to its 1948 appearance. Then, in 1978, it was then moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and leased for use in first class and dining service. It was purchased by the museum in 1996, and it is used on the museum's train and operates during special events, which are Snow Train, Autumn Color, and the Santa Express as well.
What you see right behind me is Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 563.
Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 563 was built by Pullman in 1914 and is a Boonton-type passenger coach. This car was part of an order of 77 cars built for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. All of the cars featured unique I-beam platform roof supports at each end, which earned them the nickname Boontons, as they were a familiar sight along the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western's Boonton branch through Boonton, New Jersey. Also, it was used in commuter service on the railroad as well, and passengers riding aboard it as well. Then later it was retired, and in 1963 it was brought over to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Soo Line 2645.
Soo Line 2645 was built by Alco Brooks in Dunkirk, New York in 1900 and is the 3687th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 460 10-wheeler type steam locomotive and is an E25 class steam locomotive. This locomotive was originally built for the Wisconsin Central Railroad and originally numbered as Wisconsin Central 247. When the Soo Line leased the Wisconsin Central in 1909, it was renumbered as Soo Line 2645. And for many years, this locomotive was likely used as a freight locomotive for the Soo Line and Wisconsin Central Railroad as well. Then, in 1955, it was retired and was donated to the city of Waukesha, Wisconsin, and was on display at Frame Park in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Then, in 1972, it was then moved to a railroad-themed restaurant in a former Chicago and Northwestern depot, which is a Mexican restaurant called La Estacion. Then, eventually, a realignment of ex-Chicago Northwestern track required that the locomotive be moved to, and in 1988, the Waukesha City Council therefore donated it to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was moved in 1989, and in 2004 it was cosmetically restored. Also, Soo Line 2645 is the only surviving 460 that worked the Soo Line and Wisconsin Central Railroad and can be seen preserved here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen today.
What you see right behind me is Soo Line 29967.
Soo Line 29667 was built by Haskell and Barker in Michigan City, Indiana in 1921 and is a stock car. This car was built in a number series of 400 cars numbered from 29600 through 29999, and also it was used for many years on the Soo Line on freight trains for many years and hauled livestock on board and also moved many loads of cattle from the North Dakota and Minnesota farm communities to the Chicago markets. Then the car was removed from revenue service and assigned to work service for transporting new ties and needed for track repairs. There is no evidence that the Soo Line ever renumbered it into its work service series. Then the car was retired and was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin by the Soo Line in 1971 and was restored in 1987, lettered for the style in use on the Soo Line during the later part of the 1930s. Then, in 2004, after years of display outdoors, the car's paint job was renewed again for the Soo Line Historical and Technical Society's convention held in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also can be seen preserved at the museum where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Duluth and Iron Range 5537.
Duluth and Iron Range 5537 was built by the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad in 1897 and is a flat car. This car was used on freight trains on the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad many years ago and carried cargo such as construction machines on wheels, pipes, steel, and all other types of cargo it once hauled many years ago. Then in 1938 it was then transferred to the Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range through merger as Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range 5537. Then later on this car was retired, and in 1963 it was purchased by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and in the 1980s it had been cosmetically restored to its original rail line as Duluth and Iron Range 5537, and also it is even used in the museum's freight train at special events and is preserved at the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Union Tank Line 17550.
Union Tank Line 17550 was built by Union Tank Car Company in Chicago, Illinois in 1937 and is a tanker car. Union Tank Line 17550 was used to haul liquids such as fuel and used on freight trains for many years. Then later on it was retired and came to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago and Northwestern 7409.
Chicago and Northwestern 7409 was built by Pullman in 1915 and is a combine car. It is one of 5 open platform steel combination cars that were numbered from 7407 to 7411 when it was delivered in Chicago and Northwestern's then standard yellow and green paint scheme. The interior of the car was finished in oak with cream colored steel ceilings, gas lighting, and a vapor heating system, and the car had its own coal-fired heater. In 1922 to 1923 it received similar improvements, used cup receptacles, full-length emergency brake cords, and safety chains for the side doors. In the next shopping in 1928 or 1929, it was repainted into a simple solid Pullman green exterior paint scheme. Sometime during the 1920s, one seat was removed from each car, reducing the seating capacity to 58. Between 1930 and 1933, it received the largest upgrade: strengthened end platforms, new cup holders, first aid kits, a new 2-steam train line for heating stretchers and boxes for them, hose racks, and new style weather stripping for the window sash. In 1928, this car had received a similar modification where the coach compartment was divided with a partition into 2 sections, a 12-seat smoking section and a 46-seat passenger section. Then it was suited for branch line service where a minimum of seating capacity was needed. In the 1950s, it was used in service on the Chicago and Northwestern South Dakota lines. Then the car was retired, and in 1962 it was sold to the Empire State Railway Museum in New York State. Then it was used on the Essex Steam Train and Riverboat in Essex, Connecticut. Then in 1990 it was deemed surplus and put up for sale, and early that year was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum. Also, Chicago and Northwestern 7409 is one of two surviving Chicago and Northwestern steel combine cars left in the world today, and 7411 is at the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and 7409 is preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago Northwestern 440.
Chicago and Northwestern 440 was built by Pullman in 1929 and is a lounge car. Originally, it was built as a unique salon club car and was named Minnetonka Club, and was used with several similar cars for mid-train lounge service on Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's overnight Chicago Twin Cities train Blackhawk. As it was built, it featured 4 single bedrooms, 2 compartments, 1 drawing room, and an intimate clubroom with walls finished in walnut paneling. In 1948, it was sold to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad and renumbered as New York, New Haven, and Hartford 775 and was used as a business car. In 1955, after conversion to a crew car, it was renumbered as New York, New Haven, and Hartford 100. In 1968, the Genesee and Wyoming purchased it and renamed it Edward I, and it was used as a business car. In 1980, it was bought by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad and was renumbered as Chicago and Northwestern 404 and was rebuilt the interior to its present configuration of 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, dining room, and observation room. The one end of the car was also modified, removing the closed vestibule to fabricate an open platform. In early 1982, the car was reassigned to the mechanical department and renumbered as Chicago and Northwestern 440. Then, the car was soon retired, and in 1983, the car was repainted to Pullman Green and was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and the car was named Philip R. Hastings to honor the longtime member and past president. In 2015, it was then repainted to a Chicago Northwestern yellow and green paint scheme, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum, and used for the museum's dining service as well.
What you see right behind me is Green Bay and Western 49.
Green Bay and Western 49 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1929 and is the 678 19th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive. It was assigned to haul fast freight between Kewaunee, Wisconsin and Winona, Minnesota, mainly transporting parts for the Ford Motor Company from Detroit, Michigan to an assembly plant in St. Paul, Minnesota. The train crossed Lake Michigan by car ferry and avoided the congested Greater Chicago area. Also, it was built to haul freight when being used on the Green Bay and Western Railroad as well. In 1936, it was renumbered as Green Bay and Western 350 and was downgraded to weigh freight and car ferry loading duties. Then was sold to the Consolidated Water, Power, and Paper Company as Consolidated Water, Power, and Paper Company 350 and was holding the local freight between Winona and Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, and Consolidated Water, Power, and Paper Company, a leading manufacturer of high-quality coated paper, and also the tender sides were cut down to improve visibility during switching duties. Then in 1957, the locomotive was retired and was donated to the city of Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, and was on display at the Wisconsin Rapids Municipal Zoo. Then, in 1981, it was then donated to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today. Also, Green Bay and Western 49 is the only remaining Green Bay and Western steam locomotive left in the world today and can be found here on display at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is John Morrell Company 7.
John Morrell Company 7 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1944 and is the 728-49th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an Alco S1 type diesel locomotive. This locomotive was used originally for the John Morrell Company, which was a meat packing company and was used for shunting cars around in and out of the facility as well. Then later it was sold to the Association of American Railroads and was assigned to the Chicago office. Then in 1996 it was donated to Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it is sometimes seen hauling the museum train as well.
What you see right behind me is the Chicago and Northwestern Rock Springs Depot.
The Chicago and Northwestern Rock Springs Depot was built in 1894 and was originally located in Rock Springs, Wisconsin. The town was known as Abelman after Stephen Van Rensselaer Abelman, who settled there in 1851, and the railroad has been a major influence on the village's growth. Also, it was once served by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. The depot is where people would even buy their tickets inside and also board a train to going somewhere or arriving on a train from somewhere coming in and out of Rock Springs, Wisconsin, and was next to the railroad tracks that are now used by Union Pacific. And in 1965, the building was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was carefully restored to its Chicago and Northwestern paint scheme. Inside, it houses the ticket office and gift shop and waiting room. There is a covered freight loading area attached to the north end of the building. Also, when the museum grounds had a flood from the Baraboo River, you would have thought that the platform looked a bit like a boat dock instead of a passenger train platform, but it still is, but then the flood lifted as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago and Northwestern 10.
Chicago and Northwestern 10 was built around the 1800s and is a boxcar. This car was built for 36-inch gauge rails. It had been used on the narrow gauge Chicago and Northwestern line and used for hauling cargo on board, such as wooden barrels, and was one such boxcar of the fleet, and it possibly was built before the turn of the century. Most likely it was brought to the Dinky New, as the Chicago Northwestern didn't import second-hand equipment until 1910. It is known the boxcars were used to haul ice in the winter for storage in Fenimore, Wisconsin, when the Dinky was abandoned in 1926. Several pieces of equipment were sold to local citizens for use as storage sheds. Chicago and Northwestern 10 was one such survivor. Then the car was retired and it sat on a farm until 1970, when it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was cosmetically restored, and the trucks are not original to the car, but a scrapped snowplow from another Midwest narrow gauge railroad, which was the Bellevue and Cascade Railroad of Iowa, and had acted as a donor for the trucks. Also, this car can be seen on display at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen today.
You could see right here, this is a hand car that was built for like the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, it looks like. And also, it is seen on display here at the museum. As you could see, these tracks tell you it's narrow, and this track and that track right there tell you it's standard gauge, and you could tell that the wheels on the boxcar behind me is off a bit. But yeah, this is why this handcar was made to run on standard gauge, and this boxcar was made to run on narrow gauge, and seen displayed right here at the museum. What you see right behind me is Union Tank Line 12283.
Union Tank Line 11283 was built by Lima Locomotive and Machine Company in Lima, Ohio in 1907 and is a tanker car. Union Tank Line 12283 was used to haul liquid such as fuel and used on freight trains for many years. Then later on it was retired and came to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Wisconsin Fish Commission 2.
Wisconsin Fish Commission 2 was built by Pullman in 1913 and is a fish stocking car. Also, this car is named Badger. This car was originally built for the Wisconsin Fish Commission as Wisconsin Fish Commission 2, and it was designed with a steel underframe and fitted with steel tanks to carry fish to remote locations around the state of Wisconsin to restock streams and rivers. The car would be stopped on a bridge and the tanks emptied into the water below. Then the car was sold to equipment dealer W.H. Knapp and renumbered as W.H. Knapp 104 and repainted yellow and red. Then the car was retired, and in 1960 it was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum and had been restored to its 1913 look and was the very first car to be bought by the museum. In 1962, it was moved to Hillsboro, Wisconsin to carry passengers for the first time, for the first operating season, actually. And in 1963, then on to North Freedom, Wisconsin in 1963. And also today it can be seen on display at the museum where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic 996.
Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic 996 was built in 1899 and is a gondola car. This car was believed to have been originally numbered as Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic 1854. Then, in 1920, it was renumbered as Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic 996. Also, it was used on freight trains for many years, and also was used to haul cargo like coal and gravel and other types of cargo it may have hauled years ago. Then, the car was retired, and in 1964 it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it had been restored by museum volunteers in 1988 for the Soo Line Historical and Technical Society's convention that was held in North Freedom, Wisconsin. It was used in service on the museum's freight train during snow train and autumn color weekends in the early 1990s and was retired from active service in 1994. Today, it is on display in the coach shed as well.
What you see right behind me is Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range 7122.
Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range 7122 was built by the Peatler Car Company in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1912 and is a reefer. Originally, it was numbered as Duluth and Iron Range 8022, and also it was used on the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad on freight trains on a line of reefers, and also it was used to haul potatoes from the Iron Range area to market. It actually performed a reverse function in keeping the product warm from the freezing climate of the northern Minnesota, where Duluth and Iron Range operated. Then, in 1938, after the consolidation of Duluth and Iron Range and Duluth, Mesabi, and Northern, it was renumbered as Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range 7122. Then, in 1957, it was retired and it was acquired by the Lake Superior Museum of Transportation in Duluth, Minnesota, and remained in storage in Duluth, Minnesota. Then, in 1998, it was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was restored to its Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range appearance and seen on display in the coach shed as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 17772.
Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 17772 was built by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific shops in Chicago, Illinois in 1940 and is an outbraced wooden caboose. Originally, it was built as an outbraced wooden boxcar as Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific 4867, which was built by the Bettendorf Company of Bettendorf, Iowa. Then later it was rebuilt as a wooden caboose, and it is part of the number series from 17765 to 17784. It features a baggage room section with sliding side doors similar to a baggage car. Also, it was used as the train crew's office for many years and also was used on the back of freight trains for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad as well. Then it was retired, and in 1967 it was sold to a noted rail photographer and member of Mid-Continent Railway Museum, Dr. Philip R. Hastings, in Albert Lea, Minnesota. Then it was moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also today it is used as a bunk facility as well.
You can see right behind these Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 557.
Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 557 was built by Pullman in 1914 and is a Boonton-type passenger coach. This car was part of an order of 77 cars built for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. All of the cars featured unique I-beam platform roof supports at each end, which earned them the nickname Boontons, as they were a familiar sight along the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western's Boonton branch through Boonton, New Jersey. Also, it was used in commuter service on the railroad as well, and passengers riding aboard it as well. Then later it was retired, and in 1963 it was brought over to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 425.
Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western 425 was built by Pullman in 1917 and is a Boonton-type combine car. This car was part of an order of 77 cars built for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. Also, it has a baggage compartment and a passenger compartment, as it's known as a combine car as well. All of the cars featured unique I-beam platform roof supports at each end, which earned them the nickname Boontons, as they were a familiar sight along the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western's Boonton branch through Boonton, New Jersey. Also, it was used in commuter service on the railroad as well, and passengers riding aboard it as well. Then it was soon retired and was purchased by an individual and brought to North Freedom, Wisconsin, along with 3 other Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western coaches, and then in 1972 it was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it sat in storage for many years until purchased by the museum in 1992, and in 1993 it was back in service, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is United States Army 1256.
United States Army 1256 was built by Baldwin Lima Hamilton Whitcomb in Eddystone, Pennsylvania in 1954 and is the 612 11th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is an RS4TC type diesel locomotive. It was originally built for the United States Army and Air Force and was delivered to Sharp Ammo Depot in Lathrop, California, and placed in storage. Later used at Detroit Tank Plant, it was rebuilt by Construction and Mine Services, Teed Annex, in 1986. The rebuild incorporated a 500 HP Caterpillar 3508 diesel engine, new electrical gear, and roller bearing axles. The new RS4TC A1 class locomotive worked at Hill Air Force Base in Utah until transferred to Badger Army Ammunition Plant near Baraboo, Wisconsin, sometime between 1991 and 1994. Then, in September 2006, the Army decided to dispose of the locomotive and allow it to be shipped to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, until its final disposition was known, and it arrived at the museum and was purchased by members and friends of the museum at auction and donated it to the museum, and also it is sometimes seen operating on the museum's tracks and pulling the museum's train as well.
What you see right behind me is Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22.
Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22 was built by Alco in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1910 and is the 469 44th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive. Originally, it was built for the Marquette and Southeastern Railway as Marquette and Southeastern 38 in Marquette, Michigan. Then, in 1911, it was used by the Munising Marquette and Southeastern as Munising Marquette and Southeastern 38. Then, in 1924, when the Munising Marquette and Southeastern was merged into the Lake Superior and Ishpeming, it was soon renumbered as Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22 and was likely used to haul freight as well. Then, in 1963, it was sold along with many other Lake Superior and Ishpeming locomotives to a local tourist line called Marquette and Huron Mountain, and the locomotive as Marquette and Huron Mountain 22. Then the locomotive was retired, and in 1984, Marquette and Huron Mountain Railroad suspended operations and their equipment was sold at auction, and this locomotive got sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it had been going under cosmetic restoration, and it was completed in 2017. Also, Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22 is one of 11 surviving Lake Superior and Ishpeming steam locomotives surviving today, and all of them surviving are 280 consolidation types, and 22 can be found here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Copper Range 60.
Copper Range 60 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1903 and is a passenger car. Originally, it was numbered as Copper Range 60 and it is one of 6 cars numbered from 55 to 60, and it had been used on the Copper Range Railroad for several years. The interior was originally stained and varnished with a golden oak finish. In addition to solid oak woodwork, the car had oak veneer, headlining, and ceiling panels. The seats were upholstered with rattan. During the 1944 rebuild, the oak veneer ceiling panels were replaced with painted panels and the rattan seats were changed to red plush, which are from Copper Range Coach 51. Then it was retired, and in 1982 it came to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it was moved to the museum's new site in North Freedom, and it had been awaiting restoration. A new roof was installed in 1984. In 1993, museum volunteers focused their efforts on performing a complete restoration, and restoration was finally complete. And also it can be seen displayed in the coach shed as well.
What you see right behind me is Copper Range 25.
Copper Range 25 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1903 and is a combine car. Originally, it was numbered as Copper Range 59, and it is one of 6 cars numbered from 55 to 60, and it had been used on the Copper Range Railroad for several years and had a green brighter than Pullman green and striped in gold. The interior of the coach was originally stained and varnished with a golden oak finish. In addition to solid oak woodwork, the car had oak veneer headlining and ceiling panels. The seats were upholstered with rattan. Then, in 1913, it was rebuilt as a combination baggage coach and renumbered as Copper Range 25. Then later the car was retired, and in 1963 it came to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it was moved to the museum's new site in North Freedom, and it was restored to the standard Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul orange and maroon paint scheme adopted by the Copper Range in 1911. Also, it was used on the museum's passenger train in the early 1970s. In 2013, the car was masterfully restored back to its 1913 appearance, both on the interior and exterior, following a 5-year restoration process. The exterior restoration included rebuilding both end platforms, reproducing the original buffers, replacing the steps, repairing the trucks, and painting the car. Also, it is sometimes seen being hauled on the museum's train as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago and Northwestern 10802.
Chicago Northwestern 10802 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1909 and is a drover's caboose. It was believed to have been in the number series of 1516 to 2181. This caboose was used on the Chicago Northwestern Railroad for many years and used as the train crew's office and was used behind freight trains as well. In 1937, it had been rebuilt and the cupolas were removed and the double sash windows had already been replaced with standard design in a 1923 rebuilding. The car body completely resided and a steel underframe was applied. It was repainted in a boxcar red oxide paint and renumbered in the 10800 series, but with only even numbers. In 1941, Chicago Northwestern adopted a new paint scheme for its caboose fleet, which was a bright vermilion red. The drovers eventually received this color one by one. They were also converted to AB-type air brakes and as required by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and this car was converted in 1952 in Norfolk, Nebraska. By the early 1960s, only 2 Chicago Northwestern drovers cabooses remained, and 10800 is at the Black Hills Central Railroad in Hill City, South Dakota, and this one was bought from the Chicago Northwestern in 1965. In 1968, it was painted a dull green and lettered for the New York Central for filming of the Swedish production The Immigrants. In the 1970s, the car sat in storage, suffering the ravages of Wisconsin weather. In 1985, restoration began. By 1995, the car was recited and received a new roof and was painted and lettered as it appeared after its 1937 rebuild. It performed in freight train service for the Chicago Northwestern Historical Society's annual meet held in North Freedom, Wisconsin in 1995. The interior was restored and the trucks rebuilt a few years later. Also, it is sometimes in service and usually is on display in the coach shed, and it is occasionally used at special events to increase passenger capacity as well.
What you see right behind me is Montana Western 31.
Montana Western 31 was built by Electromotive Corp. In Cleveland, Ohio in 1925 and is the 1/30th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a combine motor car. Originally, it was built for the Great Northern Railroad as Great Northern 2313 and used for hauling passengers on board, and it also has a baggage area, smoking compartment, passenger area, and opposite end control area. Then in 1940, it was then sold to Montana Western Railroad and renumbered as Montana Western 31 and used for the Montana Western Railroad as well. Then it was retired, and in 1966 it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today, and also it operated for a while on the museum's tracks starting in April 1972, and then in August that year it was moved to Electromotive Division's factory in LaGrange, Illinois to help celebrate Electromotive Division's 50th anniversary, where at least 10,000 people toured the car, and then after that it came back to North Freedom, Wisconsin. In 1982, it ran excursions on the Chicago Northwestern Main Line from the museum in North Freedom to Devil's Lake. Then it stopped running afterwards in 1987, and today it is on display in the coach shed where it can be seen today, and as well it is the oldest surviving and largely unmodified gas-electric car built by the Electromotive Corporation as well.
What you see right behind me is Copper Range 29.
Copper Range 29 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1907 and is the 42,504th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive and is a C2 class steam locomotive. It was originally built to work the Copper Range Railroad in Houghton, Michigan, which was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It is one of 8 C2 class consolidation type steam locomotives that the Copper Range purchased for freight service. As business declined and locomotives were retired, the Copper Range utilized this locomotive for freight and passenger service. This was especially the case during World War II when passenger service was reinstituted. During this period, the Copper Range provided passenger service between Houghton and McKeever for a connection with the Milwaukee Road's Chippewa service to Chicago. Then the locomotive was retired later on and was nearly scrapped, but then made it past the torch and hid away in the Copper Range at the Houghton Roundhouse in 1953. In 1967, it was sold to Keweenaw Central Railroad, which is a tourist operation and used on their passenger excursion between Calumet and Lake Linden, Michigan. Boiler problems sidelined the locomotive in the fall of 1970. The abandonment of the Copper Range Railroad in 1972 forced Keweenaw Central to cease operations and move their equipment out of Calumet. It sat outside the ruins of the Quincy Smelter in Hancock, Michigan, exposed to the elements from 1973 until it was finally offered to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in 2004, and in the summer that year, it was moved to the museum and then arrived at the museum. Also, it has gone under cosmetic restoration till it was completed. Also, Copper Range 29 is the only surviving Copper Range steam engine left in the world today and is on display at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Wisconsin Central 306.
Wisconsin Central 306 was built by the Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1886 and is a baggage car. This car was originally used for the Chicago, Wisconsin, and Minnesota Railroad and originally numbered as Chicago, Wisconsin, and Minnesota 25, and this car was used on passenger trains carrying passengers' baggage on board when it was used by that railroad as well. Then, in 1888, it was used by the Wisconsin Central and renumbered as Wisconsin Central 306 and used on passenger trains on that railroad. In 1909, when the Soo Line gained control of the Wisconsin Central, it was renumbered as Soo Line 1605. The car was originally built with open platforms and they were removed at a later date. By 1940, it was put into bunk car work service and renumbered as Soo Line W951. Then later on the car was retired and then was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and in 1965 it was moved to the museum. Also, the window and door opening added by Soo Line when this car was converted to work service were removed by museum volunteers and new baggage doors were constructed and the exterior repainted to restore its 1900 appearance. Today, this car is on display and it has exhibits inside it and it is preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Great Northern X582.
Great Northern X582 was built by the Great Northern Railroad shops in St. Cloud, Minnesota in 1925 and is a wooden caboose. Great Northern X582 was used for the Great Northern Railroad on the back of freight trains as the train crew's office many years ago. In 1963, it was then sold to the Minnesota Transfer Railroad and renumbered as Minnesota Transfer X14 and then was used as the train crew's office for the Minnesota Transfer as well. Then, in 1971, it was retired and was then sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today, and also it had been cosmetically restored to its original look, and it took 10 years as well, and it can be found in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Boyne City Gaylord and Alpina 1.
Boyne City Gaylord and Alpina 1 was built by Russell Carr and Snowplow Company in Ridgeway, Pennsylvania in 1906 and is a snowplow. This snowplow was used on the Boyne City Gaylord and Alpina Railroad in the winter time on snowy days many years ago and would push snow off the tracks, and also a locomotive would push it as it would clear snow off the tracks as well. In 1953, it was renumbered as Boyne City Gaylord and Alpina 1 with the Boyne City Railroad's reorganization. Then, in 1959, it was retired and later placed on display in the railroad's shop building as part of a museum. Upon the Boyne City's closing in 1975, it was auctioned off and then donated by the buyer to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. And also, in 1977, it suffered serious damage while it was being moved by rail to the museum grounds in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and heavy repairs consisting of replacement of the lower end of the plow backbone timbers were completed in 1981, and then it arrived at the museum and can be seen on display in the coach shed where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Soo Line 15604.
Soo Line 15604 was built by Wells and French in Chicago, Illinois in 1897 and is a boxcar. This car is one of 500 cars in that order that were numbered $115,000 to $159,88, but in even numbers only. This car was used for many years on the Soo Line on freight trains for many years and hauled cargo such as wooden boxes and barrels. Then it was acquired by the Goodman Lumber Company for in-plant use at its Goodman, Wisconsin facilities. The car was renumbered as Goodman Lumber Company 206. Then in 1996, the Goodman Division, Calumet and Hecla, Inc. donated it to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was restored in 1967 and returned to its original Soo Line number as Soo Line 15604 and seen on display in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Great Northern 3261.
Great Northern 3261 was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1906 and is a passenger coach. This car was originally numbered as Great Northern 271 and was one of 15 identical coaches numbered from 260 to 274. It was purchased for use on the Great Northern St. Paul, Minneapolis to Hutchinson, Minnesota branch that served the resort areas along the north shore of Lake Minnetonka. Along the line, at Minnetonka Beach, the Great Northern owned and operated the Swank Hotel Lafayette, which was originally built in the early 1800s, then later the Lafayette Club. It was then later renumbered as Great Northern 261. Then, in 1908, it was renumbered as Great Northern 3261. In 1922, fire destroyed the Lafayette Club and soon followed decreases in service and increasing fares. In 1926, this car along with 8 other late coaches were taken out of passenger service and converted into Stockman's coaches. Stockman's cars provided sleeping accommodations for the ranchers traveling with their livestock on a stock train, and this car was renumbered as Great Northern X791, and the seats and stained glass windows were removed and bunks were installed. In 1928, a steel underframe was applied to the car to better suit the car for use in freight trains. Then, in 1969, it was retired and was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and the car was restored to its passenger coach configuration and original number as Great Northern 271 in 1972 and was in train service. In 1990, it was removed from service due to a leaking roof and placed in the car shop for a much-needed exterior restoration. Then it was given its second number as Great Northern 3261, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Wisconsin Central 63.
Wisconsin Central 63 was built by Pullman in 1905 and is a passenger coach. This car had been used for passenger service on the Wisconsin Central Railroad and used on passenger trains for the Wisconsin Central Railroad. Then, in 1909, when the Wisconsin Central came under the control of the Soo Line, and it was renumbered as Soo Line 1941 and was used for passenger service on the Soo Line as well. Then, in 1935, it was soon put into work train service and was renumbered as Soo Line W323 and became a bunk car and foreman's office. Then, in 1964, it was retired and was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it was restored to its 1905 look, and also it is sometimes seen carried on the museum's train and people even riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic 18052.
Duluth South Shore and Atlantic 18052 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1916 and is a boxcar. This car was originally used by the New York Central Railroad as New York Central 258905, and in 1916 the New York Central system took delivery of 1,000 double-door automobile cars and had a 40-ton capacity, steel underframe, double wood sheathed sidewall construction, and a staggered double side door to accommodate the bulky automobiles. In 1935, it was then purchased by the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic Railroad and renumbered as Duluth South Shore and Atlantic 18052, and had been used for the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic Railroad on freight trains. In 1946, the railroad rebuilt into single-door boxcar, and the original Vulcan T section trucks replaced and K brakes updated with Type AB. In 1952, it was converted to work service as a tool car for wrecker support and was renumbered as Duluth South Shore and Atlantic A21. Then, in 1961, after the consolidation of the South Shore with the Soo Line, the car was then assigned Soo Line Work Service and renumbered as Soo Line D281. Then later on, the car was retired and in 1966 was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it had been used in freight train service during special events at the museum ever since as well.
What you see right behind me is Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western 63.
Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western 63 was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1888 and is a passenger coach. It was originally built for first-class service on the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railway, and the interior finish is varnished cherry wood and was designed by Edward Kalana. In 1893, the railroad was acquired by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and after the takeover, the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western by Chicago Northwestern, the car was renumbered as Chicago and Northwestern 469. Then, in 1930, the car was retired and was placed on a foundation to become a yard office at Chicago Northwestern's Wood Street Potato Yard in Chicago, Illinois. Then, in 1970, it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it got restored and then put on display and scene preserved here at the museum, where it can be seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is the Soo Line Oak Park.
The Soo Line Oak Park coach was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1884 and is a business car. This car was originally built as a business car. It was originally built for the Wisconsin Central Railroad as Wisconsin Central Oak Park and built as a 31-seat cafe parlor car. This car operated as a first-class car, and also it had smoking rooms at both ends and parlor car seating in a center room. A small kitchen was located near one end of the center room. The interior woodwork featured fine cherry wood trim accented with bird's eye maple veneer. In 1909, the car was then relettered to reflect control by the Soo Line as the Soo Line Oak Park and was subsequently converted to being a business car for traveling railroad officials. In this configuration, the smoking rooms became observation rooms, and the central parlor room was remodeled to contain a single large stateroom, kitchen, and dining room. Then, in 1929, the car's name Oak Park was dropped, and the car was numbered as Soo Line 57, and in 1938, the car was again renumbered as Soo Line W118 after conversion to a bunk and dining car for work crews. In this capacity, the car served for a number of years in Gladstone, Michigan on the wreck train. Then, in 1968, the car was retired and was acquired by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was restored to its 1921-era business car appearance and can also be seen on display in this spot where it is today. What you see right behind me is Akron, Canton, and Youngstown 3151 and Akron, Canton, and Youngstown 3161. Akron, Canton, and Youngstown 3151 and 3161 were both built by Mather Car Company in the 1940s, and both of them are outbraced boxcars. These cars were both used by the Akron, Canton, and Youngstown Railroad for many years, and just prior to World War II for lease to Ohio's Akron, Canton, and Youngstown Railroad. Many smaller roads such as the Akron, Canton, and Youngstown found leasing cars financially and operationally advantageous. In 1955, the railroad no longer had need of the Mather-built cars, and they reverted back to the lesser. By this time, Mather had merged into North American Car Corp of Chicago, Illinois. The cars retained their Akron, Canton, and Youngstown numbers, but were relettered with MCAX reporting marks. Then later on, the cars were retired, and in 1966, North American Car Corp donated both of the cars to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and were lifted off their trucks and placed on the ground to be used as a storeroom for locomotive parts and supplies as well. What you see right behind me is Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range C-183. Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range C-183 was built by the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad in 1906 and is a wooden caboose. This caboose was used on the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad as Duluth and Iron Range 83 and used as the train crew's office for many years and used behind freight trains. Then, in 1938, the Duluth and Iron Range was merged into the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, and it was renumbered as Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range C-183 and used on freight trains and used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1980, it was retired and was sold to a private individual and was moved to Elroy, Wisconsin. Then, in 1983, it was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it is used as a bunk facility as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha 6110. Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha 6110 was built by the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad Shops in Hudson, Wisconsin in 1892 and is a wooden bay window caboose. It originally had a cupola and it was used as the train crew's office for many years and was used behind freight trains as well. Then later the cupola was removed and it was converted to being a bay window caboose. Then in 1974 it was retired and was sold to a private individual, and it arrived at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and today it is used as a bunk facility as well. What you see right behind me is Wisconsin and Calumet 529. Wisconsin and Calumet 529 was built by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe in 1948 and is a pre-CE class caboose. This caboose originally worked for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2221 and was used behind freight trains on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad as the train crew's office. Then, in 1969, it was transferred to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe subsidiary Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad and renumbered as Toledo, Peoria, and Western 529 and even was used behind freight trains on the Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad and as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1983, it was then sold to Joe McMillan and later leased to the Wisconsin and Calumet Railroad and renumbered as Wisconsin and Calumet 529 and moved to Janesville, Wisconsin and used by the Wisconsin and Calumet Railroad and used in freight service for a number of years until Wisconsin and Calumet was sold to Wisconsin and Southern Railroad in 1992. Then the caboose was retired and it remained in storage until it was sold to a museum member and moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin in 2000, and today it is used as a bunk facility as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago Northwestern 12476. Chicago and Northwestern 12476 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1909 and is a wooden drover's caboose. This caboose was used on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad for many years and used as the train crew's office and was used behind freight trains as well. In 1957, it was sold to the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad in Marquette, Michigan, and while it was in service there, it received diagonal steel braces at each corner of the car body and tie rod braces on the cupola to help strengthen the car for heavy iron ore train use. Then it was retired, and in 1970 it was sold to a private individual and moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen today, and today it is used as a bunk facility as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul X 918-050. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul X 918-050 was built between 1958 and 1963 and is a bunk car. Originally, it was built as a steel boxcar, and its original number is unknown, and it had been used to carry cargo such as boxes, crates, and other different kinds of loads it may have hauled years ago when being used on freight trains for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. Then it was converted to being a bunk car for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Bridges and Buildings departments, used as a bunk car for traveling crews. Then, in 1989, it was last used by the railroad's successor, the Soo Line, and around that time, it was sold to private individuals in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and was stored there for several years. Then, in 2003, it was bought by a museum member and moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin in September of that year, and today it is used as a bunk car for museum volunteers as well. What you see right behind me is Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 01601. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 01601 was built by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul shops in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1929 and is an all-steel cupola caboose. This caboose was used for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad and is part of an order of cabooses numbered from 01601 to 01615 and is the first car in that series as well as the first steel caboose of the railroad and was used as the train crew's office when being used on the back of freight trains for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad many years ago. It was then later converted to as the scale test car inspector's residence and also when remodeled for scale test car inspector service, it was remodeled and it featured hot water, shower, tile floor, and double-hung windows, and at some point it was renumbered as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 91670. Then later on it was retired and in 1977 the car was sold to equipment dealer Hyman Michaels. A museum member later purchased it, and in 1984 it arrived at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and is privately owned and used as a bunk facility and a dormitory for volunteer crews working at the museum as well. What you see right behind me is Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2026. Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2026 was possibly built by Pressed Steel Car Company, New Jersey in 1903 and is a boxcar. It was originally used on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Also, it is one of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Class XL design boxcars. It was then sold to the Lake Superior and Ishpeming and renumbered as Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2026, and also it was thought to have transported mine cables from Long Island to Upper Michigan. Then later it was retired and it was later sold to an individual in Ishpeming, Michigan who used the car for storing hardware supplies. Then, in 2007, it was transported to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and some volunteers had located it along with the other in Upper Michigan a few years prior and targeted them for preservation. The two cars had been stored on an isolated piece of track behind the original Lake Superior and Ishpeming Depot in Ishpeming, Michigan for 40 years, and when it arrived, it was cosmetically restored, and today it can be seen preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today. Also, it is privately owned by a museum member as well.
What you see right behind me is Lake Superior in Ishpeming 2011.
Lake Superior in Ishpeming 2011 was built by Pressed Steel Car Company, New Jersey in 1901 and is a boxcar. It was originally used on the Marquette and Southeastern Railroad. Then when the railroad was later merged into the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad, it was numbered as Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2011, and also it remained in the company use on the Lake Superior and Ishpeming into the 1960s. Then it was later sold to an individual in Ishpeming, Michigan who used the car for storing hardware supplies. Then, in 2007, it was transported to Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and some museum volunteers had located it along with the other in Upper Michigan a few years prior and targeted them for preservation. The two cars had been stored on an isolated piece of track behind the original Lake Superior and Ishpeming Depot in Ishpeming, Michigan for 40 years, and when it arrived it was cosmetically restored, and today it can be seen preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range C-74.
Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range C-74 was built by the Duluth, Minnesota Northern Railroad in 1924 and is a wooden caboose. Originally, this caboose was built for the Duluth, Minnesota Northern Railroad as Duluth, Minnesota and Northern C-74 and was used as the train crew's office for the Duluth, Minnesota Northern Railroad when being used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1937, it was relettered for the Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range Railroad as Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range C-74 and was used as the train crew's office for the Duluth, Mesabi and Iron Range Railroad when being used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1965, it was retired and was purchased by Mid-Continent Railway Museum members and was moved to North Freedom, Wisconsin. In 1978, it was then donated to the museum, and also it was carefully restored, and also it is sometimes seen carried on the museum's train and people even riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is Minneapolis and St. Louis 236-55.
Minneapolis and St. Louis 236-55 was built in 1947 and is a flat car. This car was used for the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad and would be used to carry cargo that a flat car like this one once hauled on the railroad many years ago. Then, in 1956, it was renumbered to 16021 and the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad merged into the Chicago Northwestern Railroad in 1960, and the car was used by that railroad but retained its number. Then, in 1967, the Chicago Northwestern renumbered the car back to its original number. Then later on it was retired, and in 1984 it was then donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. It was used variously as an idler car for cranes and even storing large parts. Today it is preserved here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Pullman Standard 4.
Pullman Standard 4 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1943 and is the 177/98 diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 45-ton center cab type diesel locomotive. Originally, it was built for the United States Navy and was originally numbered as United States Navy 65-00408. Then, later, the scrap dealer Precision Engineering purchased the locomotive from the Navy and was sold to car builder Pullman Standard, and the locomotive renumbered as Pullman Standard 4. Then the locomotive was retired and in 1972 was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and is used for moving equipment in and out of the shop as well as cars in the yard.
What you see right behind me is Great Northern 6.
Great Northern 6 was built by Pullman in 1913 and is a generator car. This car was originally a railway post office car and originally numbered as Great Northern 90 and was one of a pair of RPO mail cars, and the numbers were 90 and 91. In 1926, it was renumbered as Great Northern 19, as well as the sister was renumbered 20 and was converted to being a mail storage car. In 1928, it was renumbered as Great Northern 200 and sister renumbered as 201. Then, in 1943, it was renumbered as Great Northern 6 and sister car was renumbered as Great Northern 7 and was converted to being a steam generator heater car. In 1968, the Western Pacific anticipated using freight locomotives to power the California Zephyr and purchased 3 heater cars from Great Northern Railroad, including this one, and was renumbered as Western Pacific 593 and did pretty well and proving more reliable than the aging boilers in Western Pacific's F units. In 1972, this car was no longer needed, so it was then sold to the tourist railroad Oregon Pacific and Eastern as Oregon Pacific and Eastern 593. Then the car was retired, and in 1988 it was sold to Weblea Inc. in Chicago, Illinois. Then, in 1992, it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was rolled to the museum. In 2001, it was repainted into Pullman green. Then in 2015 into its colorful 1940s Great Northern Empire Builder scheme, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train, and it is used for heating the museum's train during the winter time as well.
What you see right behind me is Chesapeake, Ohio 50684.
Chesapeake, Ohio 50684 was built by Standard Steel Car Company in Butler, Pennsylvania in 1909 and is a 2-bay hopper car. This car was used by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad many years ago, being used on mixed traffic trains or on a train with hopper cars, and was mostly used to haul coal for the railroad. Then, in 1935, the railroad sold the car to the Wisconsin Electric Railway and Light Company and was renumbered E134 for that company. Then, in 1938, it was then transferred to the Wisconsin Electric Power Company. Then, later on, it was retired, and in 1977, it was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was used to store coal for steam locomotive use as well. Today, it is seen here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen today.
What you see right behind me is Green Bay and Western 4567.
Green Bay and Western 4567 was built by Vulcan Iron Works in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1905 and is a 2-bay hopper car. This car was built for an unknown customer. It then soon came into the hand of dealer Briggs and Turrivis, who then sold it to Kewanee, Green Bay and Western Railroad in 1929. For many